Hey, Cypher here. Border walls are a divisive topic, to say the least, but they could really use some more nuance and ambiguity. Until last year, no one had really written a survey on the topic. When I did my walls episode in 2016, this book was sorely needed. Well, I guess history just takes time. David Fry, the author of this book, was kind enough to take an interview with me. It's really changed my perspective on border walls, and it may with you. It's also a pretty good read, so well worth checking out if you want a more in-depth version of what I'm going to be talking about in this episode. In this heated atmosphere of debate,
build that wall!
We can all benefit from understanding the history better, because we're actually all walled peoples. We stem from a civilization that had been walled. Border walls have substantially changed our culture. There is one lesson we can learn from the history of walls, all the way from the past to the present, and it's quite clear. As Fry said,
And that lesson, the importance of the guards, is found everywhere.
society has changed tremendously because of walls, but that one thing remains the same. From Han advisors in the 2nd century AD to generals during World War II, we can find that sentiment repeated. A wall is only as good as its defenders. Those defenders have changed over time. Eventually, border walls became obsolete, as inventions from within those walls destroyed their effectiveness and overruled the one fear those walls were built to defend against. But now we live in a new era of border walls. The debate rages on, with little understanding of the history walls represent.
All around me are familiar faces.
When I asked Fry,
what bit of history do you think is lacking in the current conversation?
All of it. I think actually that people, and historians included, are surprisingly oblivious to the role of walls in the history of civilization.
taking account of how walls changed us is an integral part of our history, and it's almost entirely forgotten in the current discourse. Almost invariably, cultures that become civilizations build city walls. From Sumer to the Aztecs, we see this again and again. City walls appear to be a key component of the civilizing process. So it's not much of a leap to go from simply walling a city to walling an entire empire. Rome, China, Persia, and numerous others built their walls at impossible bounds, sometimes repeatedly. What were they protecting? You see, when people wall up a city, they have a place to take refuge. When they wall up an empire, they have an entire country as refuge. When the Roman limes were built during Hadrian's time, these border walls led to a time of great prosperity. An orator named Aelius Aristides celebrated this Pax Romana by saying, "Now total security, universal and clear to all, has been given to the earth itself and those who inhabit it." Rome became a walled empire, as so many others had. With this security, people could farm, build their cities, and ultimately turn to higher callings like philosophy. But what were they defending against? Romans, Chinese, and Persians all use the same terminology, which roughly translates to barbarians. Nomads from the Huns to the Goths besieged ancient imperial walls. Until very recently, they were always the greatest warriors on Earth. Birthed for fighting, nomads lived a life of war, for they had no walls to protect themselves. Even Mesopotamia had to build walls against their neighbors, because they were such fierce warriors, with Shulgi building the first to be written of around 2000 BC. Civilization versus barbarians was the fight of walled versus unwalled peoples. The Spartans even attempted to become warriors by emulating barbarians. They refused to build city walls and called the Athenians women because they hid behind such walls. Those behind walls were free from a life of constant fighting, but were weakened by that freedom. This was a sentiment we can find dating back to the most ancient of sources. is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Old Testament, and quotes from ancient barbarians taunting walled people litter the pages of history. Even when people were within walls, many wrote of the way these places sapped their prowess. As one king of Byblos complained to the pharaoh, "Like a bird in a cage, so I am here in Byblos." A kind of myth surrounds that today, where we believe that the freedom of unwalled peoples was a life of peace. Primitive pacifism and noble savagery are harmful concepts. As Fry said,
we always imagine primitive cultures as being more virtuous, more moral, more peaceful, and spiritual than civilized peoples. It's all rubbish, but it's been with us for a long time. It's been with us since the beginning of writing.
We are softened by not needing to constantly fight, but that also means we can devote ourselves to other things, just as Aristides said, but that pacification came at a cost. That's why imperial walls were eventually manned by the very nomads they protected against, because empires needed fierce warriors. This is where the ultimate lesson of walls comes in, because the Pax Romana of Aristides was only temporary. The barbarians began invading merely a decade after his oration, and another part of the history of walls took place throughout the empire: regression. As the limes failed, city walls had to be built once more. They literally tore down their lavish structures to make city walls, and eventually even those failed. We see this happen in China several times. When a Great Wall failed, the whole north regressed, and eventually became subject to barbarians. Iran was this way into the 20th century AD. The reason why Mesopotamia was so thoroughly lost was the failure of walls. In Persia's case, they fortified the wrong boundary, at least at first. Persia tried to stop-step barbarians to the north, but were conquered by Arabs to the southwest instead. Then when the Mongols finally invaded a couple centuries later, they found the walls undefended. All of these failures led to some of the worst carnage the world has ever seen, where travelers spoke of the Silk Road being slippery with human fat, months after the barbarian hordes rode through. This is the back and forth of walls. They only protect as long as they're well protected. But when well defended, a wall could work. Even in 1933, during a Japanese attack from Manchuria, a small force of Chinese troops halted the advance for a grueling 4 months. And they did so by defending the Ming Great Wall, originally built in the 16th and 17th centuries. At times, they literally only had swords. When Germany invaded France 7 years later, they had to skirt around the Maginot Line, and then, when they finally tried to take the Maginot Line from behind it, they failed. Only the Vichy order to stand down stopped the Maginot Line from being the last holdout in France against the Germans. But these are tales of the last remnants of a bygone era. Defensive walls are a thing of the past. When the Turks besieged the city of Constantinople in 1453, they had something different with them from the last several tries. The old imperial walls had been unmanned or easily taken by invading Turks, but the walls of Constantinople withheld. A smithy turned mercenary named Orban betrayed his native soil and built for Mehmed the Conqueror what became the end of walls. His monstrous bombards were raised from his foundry and found their way to the siege. Punching through those great walls, everyone knew the days of great walls were numbered. Sure, castles and forts would still play a role in defensive works, but they were constantly giving ground to gunpowder. 3 centuries later, Voltaire said, "The Great Wall of China is a monument to fear." This was vainglorious forgetting. As Fry said,
in my mind, calling it a monument to fear is a little bit like calling a grain silo a monument to hunger, or a school a monument to illiteracy.
Voltaire's world, just as ours today, forgot that it was built upon great walls. We were shaped by hiding behind their edifices. Civilization was only made possible by such defensive works. Today we chant slogans like,
Build bridges, not walls!
yet fail to comprehend our own ignorance. Hilariously, bridges have been the more aggressive implement historically, being built for conquest, whereas walls were meant for peace. I have been just as guilty, if not more so, for I made an episode saying that these imperial walls were ultimately ineffective, purely rendering that judgment from their outcomes. That was the true weakness of the episode, but I was also trying to tackle something that was coming to fruition, a new age of walls. We may try to differentiate between fences and other forms of barriers, but this is folly. Technology like barbed wire has made walls possible again, but for whole new purposes. The Soviets somewhat began it, by building barriers all along the Iron Curtain, not just for Berlin, but all along the Eastern Bloc. These barriers were different from today's, but they were guarded in the same way. The collective amnesia we have for such barriers shows when we claim its failure simply by the fall of the Berlin Wall. Ultimately, that was because of an administrative error. The defenders failed to defend the wall. Now Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Turkey, China, and most famously the United States are all building new barriers. The US has been doing so for a century, but mostly during the Clinton and Bush administrations, back when it was a bipartisan issue. Now it is extremely partisan, and our collective amnesia is at a frenzy.
I mean, even in terms of success or failure, I mean, one of the things that people often forget is, that a wall that's going about quietly, effectively doing its job doesn't make the news. And when it doesn't make the news, it doesn't make history. When it makes history is when it fails. When people talk about walls, that they begin with a political position, and then they work backwards, and they cherry pick examples from history, and they generally get them terribly wrong. I'm not saying that history should dictate policy, but we should at least get the history right.
We are capable of being more nuanced, for the real lesson of this history is not whether walls are good or bad, but that they are only as good as their defenders. We all need to learn this lesson more thoroughly, from Donald Trump to his opponents.
A lot of it comes down to who is manning it, and do you think that still applies today?
Yes, of course. I mean, again, there's a lesson that you always need loyal and effective guards.
So check out Fry's book. The link is in the description.